Ready. Thank you, Dawa. And hi, everybody. So let's see here. Dawa will need to turn your screen share off, I think. And there we go. Well, listen. Hey, everybody. Welcome to Maestro, which course, which solely by accident has acquired the same name as a certain movie is all the rage right now. But that wasn't on purpose. Trust me on that. Our movie here, our class here, is all about conductors. Those people who lead a symphony orchestra or an opera house and have all this power and all this influence. In creating this class, I had to make a few decisions about who to cover, how to cover them, what order, and so on. One of my decisions was that I would cover only those conductors who left us audio documentation of their work. In other words, conductors who record it, whether that's via broadcast transcriptions or commercial recordings. I don't really care either which way, although I do tend to give the lion's share to commercial recordings. That was the first thing I decided. The second was how to order our conductors, how to put them together. Well, the way I decided to do it was kind of fun, is I looked for particular personality characteristics that these conductors might have, certain aspects to their work, and I turned those into 8 categories. Now, those are completely my decisions, of course, obviously. They're my own thinking, and most conductors will fall into more than one of these categories easily. But some of them were very obvious, like the legends, who are the ones we're going to do today, or the ones I sometimes call the priests. That was an easy one, too. So that's how I decided to do it. If you look on our online materials, you'll find that I have a course outline, and each week is devoted to a different sort of character type of conductor: legends, commanders, celebrities, priests, and so on. And at the beginning of a class, I will almost always tell you what I mean by that particular category, obviously, because it may not be obvious why such and such might be called, say, an adventurer, right? So therefore, they're kind of like Meyer-Briggs things, my version of those anyway. So with that in mind, let's get ourselves going here. Today, we are covering legends. Legends, okay? Legends. Now, these are conductors whose name has gone down with this aura around them, this legendary sense, this legendary aura around them. And of those, there's only really 3, I thought, who really, truly passed muster where this is concerned. And those 3, as you can see on the screen, are Arturo Toscanini, Wilhelm Furtwängler, and Herbert von Karajan. And these are the 3 I figured would be the most legendary. But one of the questions one of you are going to have right from the beginning, I hope you have this question, it's an important one to ask. And that question is, do conductors really make that big of a difference? You know, if you go to a symphony concert and you see whoever that is up on stage conducting and waving the baton about and so on, and you may hear week after week after week, and you might think, well, does it really matter that much? Well, the answer is yes, it does. It really does, and more importantly, yes, it can. And I'd like to give you a demonstration of that. Now, I've chosen extremes in this case because I want to make the point very clear. So we're going to start out with a comparison between exactly the same passage, a piece of music. It is from the second movement of the Mozart 39th Symphony, the second movement there. And I've chosen 2 different renditions by conductors of a similar generation. You can hear how differently this can be, how different they can be. Now, we start out with one of today's conductors we're going to cover. That's Arturo Toscanini. And this is his rendition of this passage. This is recorded in 1948 in Studio 8H in Rockefeller Center with the NBC Symphony Orchestra. And this is Toscanini conducting this passage. Let me make sure I've got my, yes. Okay, here we go. It'll sound a little scratchy and all that because it's a 1948 recording. So don't worry, it's not your computer or your speakers. It's the old recording. Here we go. Alrighty. Toscanini, as we'll be discussing later today and this morning, was something of a literalist about things, and he looked at that movement tempo, andante con moto. Well, andante means in a walking tempo or going. It's the Italian verb to go. Con moto, con with, moto motion. So andante with motion. So he takes the piece at quite a clip, and it's a sort of a dance tempo. And his, I think his performance sounds really quite modern. He sounds like a lot of these modern conductors who are doing period instrument performances and so on. But now let's compare that to a very different kettle of fish indeed. This is Bruno Walter, same basic generation as Toscanini, with the Columbia Symphony Orchestra. That's a pickup orchestra that was put together in Los Angeles in the late 1950s, mostly Los Angeles Philharmonic. And Bruno Walter had a very different attitude towards music, towards conducting, and especially towards Mozart, whom he viewed as this great spiritual humanistic force. And in his performances of Mozart, he always emphasized lyricism and this sense of spiritual glow. So get ready, because you almost can't recognize it as being the same piece. Here we go. Wow. Same piece, same score, same notation, two completely different personalities. Whereas Toscanini looked at the piece as a sort of a dance-like affair, rather bright, almost chipper. Walter emphasizes the lyricism and the beauty of the thing. They're both completely valid. And there's, one isn't necessarily better than the other, although between you, me, and the Post, I prefer Bruno Walter. But still, This is how much a difference the conductor can make. So let's remember that these people really can transform music. They make all sorts of amazing statements. Most of their work is behind the scenes. It's not in the performance that either Toscanini or Walter made all these differences. It was in the rehearsals. And that's where they get their ideas across. When you get into the final performance, it's like cooking a big dinner and then serving it. So often we all experience the serving of the dinner and we don't think about what was going on in the kitchen before then. But the conductor is mostly the person who works back in the kitchen, who does all of this prep work. And this is why conductors have such enormous influence over their orchestras. Bruno Walter will be on our class 4. He's the quintessential priest conductor. Today we begin with Arturo Toscanini. And Arturo Toscanini, who was the quintessential legend. Really, almost no one was more of a legend than Toscanini there for a while. And I think the main reason for that was that for almost 20 years, something like 75% of the citizens of the United States listened to Toscanini conduct concerts on Saturday nights over NBC radio. He was a fixture of American culture for all of these years. But that time, that 20 years in which he was coming into everybody's living room via their radios, was the end of his career, not the beginning. It was actually a time of his golden years, a time when most people would have been retired. He had his last fame. In fact, Toscanini's career started in the 19th century. He's a look to the past. Look at his dates, 1867 to 1957. He died at the age of 89. So he lived a good, long life. As a matter of fact, he started out as a cellist in an orchestra. He was a player. He played cello. And that's how he got his conducting start. He was in Rio de Janeiro in a opera orchestra for a sort of fly-by-night opera company. And one evening, the conductor of the orchestra just walked out. He quit. And the guy's substitute panicked and said, I can't do this at all. And some of the singers said, well, you know, this guy Toscanini, Arturo Toscanini, he's been helping us learn our parts. Maybe he knows the score. And as it turns out, Toscanini had it by memory, so he conducted, I think it was in Ballo in Maschera, by memory that evening, and that's what got him going. Toscanini was primarily, for a long time, an opera conductor. That's true of many of the great conductors. Many of them came up through the opera houses. And he worked with Verdi for quite a while. Verdi himself really loved Toscanini's work. He loved the way that Toscanini could be relied on to give a reliable performance. Toscanini also then began working a lot with Puccini. And he conducted premieres of Puccini operas, La Bohème and Pagliacci, which is not Puccini, that's a different one, Girl of the Golden West, Turandot. And before too long, he was the principal conductor at La Scala in Milan, and he also started working in America because he was also the conductor of the Metropolitan Opera for quite a while. So this guy was really a big opera conductor. That's what he was. It helped to formulate how he thought about music because he learned his craft conducting orchestras that needed a firm hand. Orchestras that were left to themselves would be very undisciplined, very sloppy. Opera orchestras tend to be that way. And so he became a kind of a dictator, a martinet, if you will, someone who absolutely insisted on the orchestra playing precisely and well, and people learning their parts properly, and like a good, solid schoolmaster. What's interesting is that this work led to him becoming the conductor of the New York Philharmonic. And it's interesting that when he became the conductor of the New York Philharmonic, he was doing with them what he had done with those opera orchestras, because the New York Philharmonic was not in good shape when Toscanini came in. They had been under Gustav Mahler as their conductor until 1911, but after that, their conductor was a fellow named Josef Stransky, who was very easygoing, and the orchestra had essentially fallen apart on his watch. The trustees of the Philharmonic decided they were going to fix that, and they brought in two different conductors to work with the orchestra. One was the Dutch conductor Willem Mengelberg, and the other was Toscanini, who they all knew from his work at the Metropolitan. Mengelberg didn't last all that long. He left after a few years. But Toscanini stayed on until 1936, at which point, by the way, he was almost 70 years old. His decade at the New York Phil is considered one of that orchestra's golden ages. He did some recording, thank heavens, so we can hear this, because in those days, especially the 1920s, broadcast transcriptions were quite rare. They were difficult to do. So most of the recordings from this era are commercial recordings. So we can hear him. We can hear what he did with the New York Phil. And one of his finest, truly finest achievements as a conductor with this orchestra was his 1936 recording of Beethoven's Seventh Symphony. This has been, as a matter of fact, hailed down the years as one of the finest performances that this symphony ever received on record. That might be a little bit of hyperbole, but man, it's a heck of a great performance. So we're going to go through the third movement of this, which is the fast movement, the scherzo. And this third movement really shows us some of Toscanini's characteristics. One of those is very sharply rhythmic. In other words, his corners are very, very, very sharp. He tends to be unsentimental about things. He's always very detailed. And his pacing might be on the fast side as a rule, but it's never rushed. Now, with this piece, he had to deal with a particular issue that comes up in it. This is a kind of a Lego construction, this piece. It has a reprise, a main body of music, that is very, very fast, like this. This very, very quick driving sort of movement. But then that is broken by another Lego piece, which is an episode which has a different character. And Beethoven marks it assai, which means very much, meno, less, presto, fast. He says, so very much less fast. And that, for most conductors, means relax it. Very much relaxed. But the fact is, that episode comes back. It's heard twice during the movement, when it has a lot of repetitions itself. And if you overdo this slow, meno presto too much, well, the piece is going to fall apart. It's going to be like your Lego pieces aren't really holding together very well. So Toscanini looks at that and he reads it, assai meno presto, okay, but still presto, because that's the tempo marking for the whole movement. So it says, yes, less presto, but still presto. So in other words, instead of going 75 miles an hour and then going to 45, no, 75 miles an hour and then we're going to go to 70 miles an hour. So it's almost imperceptible. His tempo changes in this. So here's a look at the way the movement is put together. I've got a chart for this one of my little handy-dandy charts. The reprise is in that, I think, really quite natty strawberry color. And you'll notice that this reprise is made up, okay, if you take a look at it, it is made up out of a phrase, A, which A is repeated, and then A prime, which is repeated with variant, and then a contrasting phrase, B. That's what these letters mean. The episode, which is in this rather nice dark lavender, is, as you'll notice, a new phrase, C and C, and then a contrasting phrase, D, C1, which is a modified repeat of C, and so on. Transition, that's what trans means. You see the reprise comes back again, identical to the original. The episode that comes back is more or less the same as the original, except that some of the repeats are left out. And then the reprise at the end is shortened. So there's a lot of repetition in this. I mean, look at that for a minute. You've only got basically 4 basic pieces of material, A, B, C, and D. And all of these are going to be repeated over and over. And I think this is why Toscanini very wisely looks at this movement and says, hey, no dilly-dallying here. We are not going to linger over any of this. We are going to take this puppy and we're going to move it. So here it is. Zoom, there it goes. That coda at the end, a coda is always something you add on to a piece of music at the end. So, one of the things about Toscanini you need to know is that he had a volcanic temper. He was very easily annoyed at his orchestras if something went wrong. He generally did not take it out on individuals, it was more on the orchestra as the whole. And when he blew up, which he would, it blew up and then it was over. He had the kind of temper where it would just go crazy and then he would stop after that and everything would be okay again. He was like, sort of, in some ways, I would describe him as like the patriarch of a family. He'd blow up at everybody and sort of yell at them about things, but then everything would be okay after that. He was a loving papa, if a rather yelling one. But my goodness, his rages. Oy, oy, oy. Here's just a little bit from one. This is in 1943 at the Brahms Second Symphony, and it just goes on for a moment. He just gets so upset. But I love when he uses the words horrore and porqueria, filth. Oh my goodness. Here we go.
No, 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 no! Horrore, porqueria!
Oh my! Yeah, he would do that quite a bit. Conductors can't do that anymore. By the way, you should know it's not something you can get by with nowadays, but in his days you could. So he retired at the age of 68 in 1936, almost 69 years old, and he was just going to go, relax, and he had a lovely home in New York, and maybe Italy for a while, but of course that wasn't going to last for long. But as it turns out, his greatest fame lay ahead, and that was the founding of the NBC Symphony. And it was an orchestra that was made up partially out of the radio orchestra that NBC had used for their shows, but mostly very, very fine performers all over everywhere. They had some very fine conductors and agents going out and finding some of the best instrumentalists they could find. This really was going to be a superior orchestra. It was founded on the same basic notion as the BBC Symphony, which was another really, really great orchestra made for broadcasts. And NBC got Toscanini to come out of retirement and do the Saturday evening concerts. He didn't do all of them. He had guest conductors who came in from time to time, but he did most of them. He did. So 1937 to 1952, Saturday night broadcasts, NBC all over the country. This is where the legend really, really gets going. Fortunately, they also recorded a lot of these broadcast performances. Sometimes Toscanini insisted on going back for retakes later on. But still, these came out to a long series of records on RCA Victor. Some of them were at Studio 8H, which is dry as a bone. It's a broadcast hall, not a concert hall. But more often than not, they did them in Carnegie Hall because the acoustic was so dry with those 1940s broadcasts. Let's hear some of them. This is a montage, so you get a chance to hear how he sounded over the years as he did it. Now, in this montage, be aware that sometimes this sound, the audio, is going to be very, very bright. As a matter of fact, on the edge of being shrill. That is mostly because of Studio 8H and also RCA Victor's technology of the day. So they do have a tendency to have an edge to them. So if it bothers you, you can always turn down your volume a little bit. But they don't always stay that way. Some of the later ones really get a very nice, beautiful, rounded sound to them. Pretty amazing, huh? The Horowitz was a perfect match for Toscanini with that same kind of fiery aspect to them. Extraordinary, extraordinary. So with Toscanini, there's another conductor who has spoken in this same kind of awe and reverence, but a completely, totally different animal. And this is Wilhelm Furtwängler. As you can see, his life was a little shorter than Toscanini's. He was born a little later. He died right about the same time. So with that, but still, Furtwängler remains to this day. He remains somewhat controversial. To give you a sense, he was, unlike Toscanini, who came up through the opera houses and so on, Furtwängler was born into a relatively posh family with some money and education. He conducted largely very, very fine orchestras. Leipzig Gewandhaus Orchestra, which is the Leipzig Gewandhaus Orchestra, is one of Europe's finest. That was Mendelssohn's orchestra. And then he became the principal conductor of the Berlin Philharmonic up through the end of World War II and then for a few years afterwards. What makes him controversial are two aspects. One is musically. He was very much an interventionist conductor. In other words, his own ideas were very, very much part of the performance. But the other, of course, is his behavior during the Nazi era in Germany. Because unlike most musicians and artists who got out as they could, Furtwängler stayed. And not only did he stay, but was sometimes viewed as being complicit as he was playing these concerts for these orchestras full of the audiences full of Nazis and so on. Here's Rob Cohen, a very good writer on music, and he says, repeatedly forced to test his integrity in a world that was at painful odds with his principles, Furtwängler was naive, vain, fatherly, occasionally high-handed, and unsinningly devoted to his art. And Cohen also points out that Toscanini's star has been fading some over the last couple of decades. Furtwängler remains fascinating. He remains fascinating for musical reasons and also still controversial for his personal ones. The question is, just how complicit was he? Well, a lot of people considered that he was too friendly with the Nazis. So therefore, when he was asked to take over the New York Philharmonic after Toscanini, the public sentiment was very, very strongly against him. And so he had to decline that position. However, his relationship with the Nazis was not smooth. He did not agree with much of anything about them. He viewed them, I think, mostly as a bunch of hooligans who would eventually leave. But like a lot of artists, a lot of musicians, he didn't really understand how meaningful a lot of what was going on was. Musicians, and I speak of myself this way too, we have a tendency to be rather unworldly. We spend a lot of our time studying scores, practicing, being alone, and not thinking much outside of our art. And so that's the naive aspect of Furtwängler. He really, in some ways, he didn't totally get it. He didn't get it. But in other ways, he may very well have agreed with some of the Nazis' racial principles. Certainly, the Nazi regime got less and less pleased with him, and he was designated for liquidation in 1945. He was going to be arrested and hauled off. But his friend Albert Speer warned him about it, so he was able to get out to Switzerland, where his wife and family had gone earlier, presumably for medical reasons, but he was able to get out. After the war, it took him a while. There was a denazification process, of course, which he was acquitted. Okay, he was found not to be uh, that. And so the Chicago Symphony Orchestra offered him the position of their principal conductor. And then they got letters from major headline artists, people like Horowitz, like Arthur Rubinstein, like Jascha Heifetz, all of whom said, we won't go if that man is there. So they had to rescind the offer. The other big issue with Furtwängler is the power of his music making. He viewed conducting and making music as an almost elemental spiritual force. He was not a technician. He did not have good baton technique. If you depended on him to lead the orchestra, they were probably going to fall apart. He worked best with highly experienced orchestras like Berlin because he had a crazy beat. It was all over the place. And sometimes he'd even stomp his feet to keep them together and things like that. But when he was with an orchestra that could read his mind in a way, which is kind of almost what they had to do, and with orchestras that he had worked a great deal, so they had achieved a certain synergy together, he could create some astounding, and I do mean astounding, performances. Alex Ross, the great, one of our great writers, talks about this. I'm going to give you a synopsis of this. The thing about this is that first, this recording, it's a broadcast, but it was made on magnetic tape, which the scientists at the Third Reich had invented. So it's much, much clearer than recordings of this same era. The main reason for this was so that they could record the concerts for the Nazi bigwigs to listen to them later, particularly Adolf Hitler. And Hitler probably listened to this tape after this broadcast. And you rather wonder, as Alex Ross says, what did he think of this? He calls it a borderline deranged account of the Coriolan Overture, which the Coriolan Overture is not based on Shakespeare's play, Coriolanus, but it was based on the same story. It's hard to say. What did they hear in this? But the fact is, this is a Coriolan that is violent. It's not like a Toscanini where everything's all clear and precise. You can hear the orchestra is really not always together. One of my questions is, did the orchestra not pay attention to him during a performance? No, they paid attention to him, but they didn't pay attention to his conducting beat. They watched his face and his body motions and so on. That's how he did it. It's hard to say. And as Alex Ross says, you could hear this as a defiance of the enemy, a willingness to fight to the death, maybe. Or you can hear it as being a howl of protest against Hitler, maybe. You can also just hear it as a musician going into the score and thinking, man, this thing is a scorcher, and we're going to get in there and just go for it. I'll let you decide. The piece is in classical sonata form, and there's a chart up here that shows you how that works. You're welcome to watch along as the various parts, the primary theme and the secondary theme, come along with that. Or you can just let the force of the thing carry you along, because this is an orchestra playing almost of their lives on the line. And in a way, I guess it was. So here we go. That ending is absolutely chilling. To compare this, this notes one after another, like he's dying. Compare that with some other conductors, and you see what I mean. How personalized this is, how individual. One of the things, oh, a quick question is conductors to conduct with or without a score. Well, most conductors need to have the music memorized, and that's everything every line, every instrument, every note. And that's part of learning to be a good conductor. Because of the fact that you really don't have time to be reading the music while you're conducting, especially big scores, because frankly, you're turning pages all the time. So typically, most of the big conductors have these enormous memories. They are able to hold an entire score. Now, if they're doing a brand new piece, they're going to have to use the music, of course, because they just can't, but not always. I mean, Toscanini always conducted by memory because his eyesight was so bad, he had to, basically. But Furtwängler was also big on conducting by memory. They might have a score out there, but they're hardly looking at it. That's what they do. But that's part of the training. It literally is. There was a conducting teacher at Curtis who would stop his student in the middle of a rehearsal or something and say, okay, tell me, what is the note for the second oboe in the third beat of bar 67? And the poor guy has to know it, or woman has to know it. So that's a big part of being a conductor. You have to know what your orchestra is doing. Because after all, how can you lead them if you don't know what they're playing? So, generally speaking, usually by memory. Let's hear some Furtwängler over the years, shall we? This is a montage starting with a piece that he made his own for year after year after year, and that's Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. And always this vivid, amazing personality. Wilhelm Furtwängler. 1944, folks, right there at the ending. The bombs are falling, and that's almost music for Armageddon, conducted by Wilhelm Furtwängler. Let's take a 5 minute break, please. 5 minutes, and then we will be back at exactly 11:10 for one more conductor. Alrighty, so 5 minutes, please. Short break since Thank you. It's a very short break since we don't really need to take too much time here. You know, it's not like you have to, those of you who are at home, you don't have to wait in line for the restroom or anything like that. And here at our break, I'd like to mention a couple of things too. We had a reminder in the chat thing, and thank you, George, for this. Is that if you would like to see some of these conductors that we're covering, if you want to see them at work, either in concert or sometimes even in rehearsals, YouTube is a fantastic resource for this. I'm not going to use those videos because they're so easy to find. I mean, they're all right out there. But YouTube can be a really cool resource for seeing what video there is. There's some video of Furtwängler conducting, for example, in Berlin. That's absolutely chilling when you see people like Goebbels sitting out there in the audience. And so on, but they're all there. So if you go on YouTube and you just search for a particular conductor, so on, you'll probably be able to find plenty of material. So YouTube really is an extraordinary resource for us. So in our time that we have left, we have another very important legendary conductor, and that is Herbert von Karajan. Karajan, that's how it's pronounced, Karajan. Herbert von Karajan. It's sometimes hard to describe just how influential von Karajan became during his lifetime. The very first part of his career, when he was a very young man, he was conducting on opera houses, particularly in Ulm. He became a kind of a shadow of Furtwängler. A lot of the Nazi bigwigs saw Karajan as being a possible way of countering Furtwängler and keeping Furtwängler in line because von Karajan was so promising. They called him Das Wunder Karajan, the wondrous Karajan. And he was an extraordinary, truly extraordinary conductor, extraordinarily minded music, an extraordinary way of leading an orchestra. He was probably one of the reasons that Furtwängler stayed in Germany, in fact, because Furtwängler was worried that von Karajan was going to supplant him. He's also probably the reason that Furtwängler went back to the concert hall after he was denazified, because again, he was worried about what was going to happen with von Karajan. Von Karajan was his younger competitive colleague who just drove him bats. And eventually, after Furtwängler's death, von Karajan did succeed him at the head of the Berlin Philharmonic Orchestra and became an astounding power in music. One of the most spectacularly successful conductors ever. Also one of the richest as well, making just beyond money. And the single most recorded conductor in history. Herbert von Karajan was instrumental in several aspects of modern recording. Herbert von Karajan had a lot to do with the creation of the compact disc, for example. One of the reasons why CDs play for 70 minutes is because von Karajan decreed that they would play for 70 minutes so that you could get the entirety of the Beethoven Ninth Symphony on one CD. He was also instrumental in the development of the digital video disc as well, the DVD. He was the absolute boss of the Berlin Philharmonic for a good 30 plus years. He also was a major conductor of the Vienna Philharmonic, as well as the Salzburg Festival, which was pretty much his little kingdom. He also conducted the Orchestre de Paris, and early in his career, he was the conductor of London's Philharmonia Orchestra, and he left us an enormous legacy with all of these works. The Nazi issue, yes, he was. Okay, let's just put it on the table. Yes, he was. He belonged to the Nazi Party. Okay, uh, the party, and they used him as a cudgel to keep Fort Vongler in line. Quick question here on the slides. Who did you say you might see in the audience in a YouTube performance? There's a YouTube performance of Fort Vongler conducting where you can see Joseph Goebbels out there in the audience. And so on. There's one where he also, Goebbels shakes hands with him. It's pretty chilling, really. However, Carry On's Nazi past was as much opportunistic, I think, as anything else. He married a part Jewish woman, which put him very much out of favor. And he was cleared, although not completely, in the years following. So through the 1950s, he was mostly in England and then returned to Berlin in the late 50s, where he became, as I said, the conductor of the Berlin Philharmonic. There's a Von Karajan sound. Opulent, plush, padded, big, huge, gorgeous sound. He was sometimes criticized for that. Not that the sound was a bad thing, but because it had a tendency to mask the details. Everything came out in this big billow of sound. And sometimes people said he applied it to everything indiscriminately. But in fact, if you really listen to the guy, and there's plenty of opportunities to do that, you find that he could change sound just fine, as was needed. So it's kind of a bum rap, the sound thing. He was also a superb accompanist. He also was a star maker. And there were certain people like Leontine Price and Anne-Sophie Mutter, Evgeny Kissin, whose careers he really gave a boost to. He has some surprising areas where he was really good. For example, Debussy. Who would think that a Austrian-German, conductor would be? He was also very good at difficult modern music with that. However, his great achievements, though, like Fort Vongler and like Toscanini, really, was in the central orchestral repertory. Beethoven, Brahms, Bruckner, Schumann, and big operas, the Puccini, the Verdi, Wagner, so on. He's often a great choice for the great big landmarks of the repertory. And no landmark is bigger than the first Brahms symphony, which took Brahms forever to write. 20 years it took him to get it before he was happy. But when you hear Carry On in control of the Berlin Philharmonic, this is his 1978 recording of this symphony. He made quite a few of them. When you hear him at the head of this, you realize just what an Olympian view he had of music. It's sort of, in a way, he's like Fort Vongler, in a way, but with really good orchestral technique. His orchestra would be right together, everybody very tight, very, very close. So he's like Toscanini in the aspect that he's very, very controlled with the orchestra, that he really controls them well. But like Fort Vongler in this sense of this magisterial view. And I don't think anything shows that better than his performance of this final movement of the Brahms First Symphony. This movement that took Brahms so long to find over the years. And he was not willing to let the First Symphony out until he was sure that he had it right. He had what it had to be. And of course, he did get it eventually. It took him until the 1870s to do it. The movement opens in a limbo. I like to think of it as being like that numbness that can follow a shattering event or an accident or something. It's this just moment of, oh, what? What? What follows that numbness is angst and fear and a greater sense of energy. Which then gives way as this darkness, the angst, the fear, there's a dawning. And this beautiful alpine horn-like theme that breaks in. It's in the major mode, not in minor, as we've half been. Minor, which is dark. Now it's in major, greater light, this alpine horn theme. Which then gives way to what is actually the primary theme of the movement. It resembles, excuse me, I better, excuse me, it resembles Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, the great Ode to Joy. It resembles it. And I think very much on purpose, because there were a lot of people who thought of this Brahms First Symphony as being essentially the 10th Symphony, the next great symphony after the Beethovens. So, the wonderful primary theme. That runs its course through what is classical sonata form. That is exposition, development, and recap. And in the exposition, you have a primary theme that makes its way to a transition, to secondary themes, to closing themes. That's the way these things work. However, he skips the middle part. He skips the development. He goes directly from the first part, the exposition, directly to the recapitulation. Okay, like that. No middle section. Doesn't really need it. And then he adds a coda to the end, a big one, and he ends the movement in a radiant burst of light, sunburst of light. To do this movement justice requires a conductor with vision, a conductor who can control the size of the thing, because it's a great, big, huge movement, and if the conductor isn't careful, it can fall apart very, very easily. At the same time, though, keeping it moving, keeping things going, a conductor who can balance the orchestra. Brahms' orchestration tends to be a little thick, so therefore the tendency, you've got to really get in there and make sure you're bringing out certain instruments, keeping things clear. Not rushing it, not overdoing it, not underdoing it. It's not an easy movement to conduct. Carry-on is very much up to the task, of course, and you're hearing him later in his life here, after a lifetime of studying this movement with the mighty Berlin Philharmonic at their absolute peak. Von Carrion has his detractors. He does. There was a journalist who, some time ago, wrote an article called "The Monster in His Myth." It's, wow, and so on. Yes, he has his detractors. People who feel that he was too powerful. People that feel that his use of the orchestra was just too big and opulent all the time, and so on. I am not one of those. Anybody who can create a Brahms first like that, with that kind of majesty, that kind of power, and bring that out of that magnificent orchestra, which he could do all the time, really, he was very, very common, is okay in my book. He was also, one last little tidbit and then we'll stop. He, his third wife was a beautiful, gorgeous woman, a socialite, very much sort of jet setter type. And there's a story that one evening she and her friends came over to their villa near Salzburg, and they were going to go out on the town and have a great evening. And Herbert said, "Okay, well, you go ahead and go. I've got work to do." And he sat down on the floor of the villa on the carpet, studying his scores for the evening. And that's, to me, is the essence of Herbert von Karajan. All the power, he had airplanes, he had motorcycles, he had automobiles, he had this, he had that. But ultimately, he was a guy who liked to sit on the floor in his living room, studying his scores and making his music. And he was that to the end. So, next week, we are going to look at some conductors who were, to put it mildly, alpha males. That's where these people were. They were the Toscanini types, the big controllers of the orchestra. There's all sorts of names you can call them. I call them the commanders. And so we will look at them, Otto Klemperer, George Zell, Fritz Reiner, and as time permits, Wilhelm Mengelberg. That will be next week. So we'll be looking at these extraordinary orchestra builders and orchestra managers next week. Until then, thank you all and have a great, wonderful week, everybody. Have a great week. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, everybody. See you all next week.
Bye-bye.
Take care until then.
Take care.
Bye-bye.